Nathaniel Cross was still recovering from hip surgery in a rehabilitation facility 20 miles away when a for sale estate liquidation sign appeared in his front yard on Millstone Row, planted there by a realtor named Denise Farro at the personal request of HOA President Regina Holt, who had declared the property effectively abandoned after 8 weeks of unmowed grass and uncollected mail. Denise began the routine title search every listing required, expecting the usual 30-minute formality. Instead, she sat frozen at her desk 20 minutes later, staring at a document that named the legal owner of not just Nathaniel's lot, but the road running in front of every single house on the street, as Cross Family Holdings, LLC. Stay with Nathaniel as one presumptuous abandonment listing unravels into the discovery of exactly whose community Regina Holt had been running for the past 4 years. Nathaniel Cross was 45 years old, a quiet, unassuming man who drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, worked from home doing freelance architectural consulting, and had lived modestly on Millstone Row for 6 years without ever once mentioning that his late father, Elias Cross, had originally developed the entire street 40 years earlier. A fact Nathaniel had no particular reason to advertise, since he'd simply wanted, after his father's death, to live quietly in one of the modest homes his father had built rather than in the family's larger properties elsewhere. When Elias Cross developed Millstone Row decades earlier, he sold each individual lot outright to homeowners but structured the deal, unusually, to retain permanent ownership of the street itself, the road, the underlying utility easements, and a reversionary interest in the community's shared green space, through a family holding company, a decision made at the time simply to maintain long-term control over infrastructure quality rather than leave it to whatever HOA might eventually form. Almost no one still living on the street remembered, or had ever been told, that this arrangement existed. Before we get into exactly what Regina Holt was about to learn, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today, because a story about someone being written off before anyone bothered to ask a single question tends to feel familiar no matter where in the world you're seeing this. Regina Holt, 52, had been Millstone Row's HOA president for 4 years, and had never once had a real conversation with Nathaniel beyond exchanging citations for an overgrown lawn and a truck she considered unbecoming of the street's image. She assumed, the way people sometimes do about quiet, unassuming neighbors, that Nathaniel was simply someone barely holding on financially. A house she'd quietly decided, long before his surgery, was dragging down the street's overall property values. When Nathaniel disappeared from the street for 8 straight weeks recovering from an unexpected hip replacement complication, Regina didn't call to check on him, didn't ask any neighbors if they'd heard from him, and didn't contact the county to verify his status. She simply decided, based entirely on an overgrown lawn and a full mailbox, that the house was abandoned and called Denise Farro, a realtor she'd worked with informally on 2 prior distressed property sales, to get the listing process moving before anyone could object. Denise, a careful professional despite Regina's pressure to move quickly, ran the standard preliminary title search any listing agent would run before ever putting a sign in the yard, and found, buried 3 layers deep in the county's recorded documents, that Nathaniel's lot deed referenced a reversionary easement held by an entity called Cross Family Holdings, LLC, an entity that, when Denise pulled the state business registry, listed Nathaniel Cross himself as managing member. Curious now rather than simply cautious, Denise pulled the recorded plat map for the entire street and found something that made her sit back in her chair. The road itself, Millstone Row's actual pavement and the utility easements running beneath every single yard, was never dedicated to the county or the HOA at all. It remained, 40 years later, private property owned outright by Cross Family Holdings. Denise called Regina immediately, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think you want me to put a sign in that yard," she said. "The man you're trying to have declared abandoned owns the road we're all standing on." Regina, certain Denise was exaggerating or mistaken, dismissed the concern and told her to proceed with the listing anyway, a decision she would come to regret within the week. A longtime resident named Harold Petrakis, who had lived on Millstone Row since it was first built and remembered Elias Cross personally from the original construction years, saw the for sale sign and immediately called Nathaniel's daughter, Simone, whose number he still had from an old neighborhood directory, to ask with genuine concern whether everything was all right with her father. Simone, horrified to learn a realtor had been contacted about her father's house while he was still in active recovery, drove to the rehabilitation facility that same afternoon to tell him in person watching her father's calm, tired expression shift into something much sharper the moment she finished explaining what Regina had done. "They didn't even call to ask if you were okay," Simone said, still holding her phone with a photo of the sign. "They just decided you didn't matter enough to check." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling tile above his hospital bed, before answering in a voice that had gone noticeably flatter than his usual easygoing tone. "That's the part that bothers me too," he said. "Not the sign, the not asking." While her father made his calls, Simone did some digging of her own, pulling up the HOA's public meeting minutes archive from her phone in the rehab facility's parking lot. She found Regina's name attached to citation after citation against her father over the years: lawn height, an unapproved truck color, a mailbox style, each one polite on paper, but forming, laid end to end, a pattern that looked less like routine enforcement and more like someone who had simply decided, from the very beginning, that her father didn't belong on that street. Nathaniel, still weeks from full mobility, didn't rush to confront anyone. He called his family's longtime attorney, a measured, unhurried man named Corwin Delacroix who had handled Cross family holdings affairs since Elias's era, and asked him to quietly pull every citation, communication, and board record Regina Holt had generated regarding Nathaniel's property over the past 4 years. Corwin's review turned up something far more troubling than a single overreaching abandonment attempt. Regina had used nearly identical distressed property, framing against 2 other Millstone Row residents over the previous 3 years. An elderly widow who'd been hospitalized for a month, and a young family who'd traveled internationally for a work assignment, both times pressuring the residents into rushed, below-market sales to buyers who, once Corwin traced the paperwork, turned out to be connected to Regina's own brother-in-law's small real estate investment firm. Corwin found that Regina's brother-in-law's firm had purchased both previous distressed properties at roughly 60% of market value, renovated them quickly, and resold them within a year at full price, a pattern that, laid out on paper, looked considerably less like community-minded property value protection and considerably more like a coordinated flipping scheme running through Regina's HOA authority. The elderly widow, once contacted by Corwin's investigator, said she had never fully understood why she'd felt so pressured to sell quickly while recovering from her hospital stay, only that Regina had described the market as cooling fast and told her, more than once, that waiting could cost her tens of thousands of dollars. Advice that turned out to directly benefit Regina's own family financially within the year. The young family, reached by phone in the country where the father's work assignment had taken them, described a nearly identical experience. Repeated messages from Regina about maintaining the street standards while they were overseas, culminating in a rush sale they'd agreed to largely out of guilt and distance, never once suspecting the buyer who'd made the quick, convenient offer was connected to the HOA president pressuring them to accept it. Rather than quietly withdraw the listing once Denise's warning should have given her pause, Regina pushed the board to formally vote on declaring Nathaniel's property in violation of community maintenance standards warranting receivership consideration. A legally shaky maneuver Corwin would later describe as creative, but built on nothing that would survive contact with an actual judge. Nathaniel, cleared for a wheelchair and determined to attend in person despite his recovery, arrived at the next board meeting with Corwin beside him, watching Regina's confident opening remarks about protecting the street's standards falter the moment she recognized who had just been wheeled through the door. If watching someone's assumptions collapse the second they realize who they've actually been dealing with is exactly the kind of moment you come back for, this is a good time to hit subscribe, because what Corwin lays out next in this meeting is one of the more satisfying reveals in this whole series. Corwin laid out the full picture for the packed boardroom: the reversionary interest in the street itself, the 2 prior distressed property sales connected to Regina's brother-in-law, and the financial pattern showing Regina had personally profited through family ties from pressuring vulnerable residents into rush sales, all while the very ground the HOA's authority technically depended on belonged, this entire time, to the family of one of the residents she'd targeted. Regina, standing at the front of the room mid-sentence, stopped speaking entirely when Corwin projected the recorded plat map showing Cross family holdings ownership of the road beneath everyone's feet. A silence that stretched long enough for several board members to exchange uneasy glances before anyone said another word. Denise, present at Corwin's request, confirmed publicly that she had warned Regina about the ownership issue before the listing sign ever went up, and that Regina had explicitly instructed her to proceed anyway, testimony that eliminated any possibility of Regina claiming the whole situation had been an honest misunderstanding. The board voted that night to remove Regina from the presidency, void the fraudulent maintenance violation vote, and formally apologize to Nathaniel and the two prior families affected by the earlier distressed property sales. Nathaniel, choosing not to exercise any drastic leverage over the street itself, instead pursued a straightforward harassment and attempted fraud claim, ultimately settling for legal costs, damages, and a combined restitution figure, covering all three affected families, totaling $410,000, funded through Regina's personal assets and a civil judgment against her brother-in-law's investment firm. Millstone Row's new interim board formally acknowledged the Cross family's continued ownership of the street for the first time in decades, and Nathaniel, largely to put residents' minds at ease rather than out of any real necessity, signed a simple written agreement guaranteeing permanent road access to every homeowner regardless of the underlying title. A formality more than anything, but one that gave the neighborhood real peace of mind. Months later, fully recovered and walking without a cane, Nathaniel stood in his front yard trimming the same overgrown hedge that had once helped convince Regina his house was abandoned, while Harold Petrakis walked past with his morning coffee, waving the way he always had. A young reporter following up on the story asked Nathaniel, half joking, whether he'd ever considered simply telling people who he was from the start. Nathaniel thought about it for a moment before answering that he'd always preferred being known as a decent neighbor rather than a wealthy one, and that the whole ordeal had only confirmed something his father used to say, back when he was still building the street with his own hands, that the people who judge a man by his lawn are usually the ones who never bother learning anything else about him. If you've ever had someone try to weaponize against you, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it ended. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.